And now I'll turn us over to Dr. David Fawcett.
Great, Scott, thank you. Yeah, I just want to mention the documentary's been making the rounds in Texas, doing really well there too. So yeah, so I did want to talk tonight about intensity. You know, I often refer to sex and porn and chemsex addictions as intensity addictions. And I wanted to kind of explain what I mean by that when I say that. You know, all of these are real stimulating behaviors. And usually we find amphetamine drugs fall into that category, but behaviorally we see sex, porn, we see other things too, though: gambling, kleptomania, work, higher sports, certain gaming. All these things have a lot of intensity and fantasy. And I think that becomes sort of a cycle of addiction in and of itself. These are all avenues to get that intensity that people sort of need. So we ask, what does intensity do? What's so thrilling about that? Well, we know there's an excitement feature that adds some dopamine to the energy that's going on. But we also know that when people are pursuing intensity, and especially the kind that comes with addictive acting out, with the high risk behaviors and the chance of getting caught and the danger and the just sometimes basically stupid activities people do just for the risk and get involved. It's a lot about escaping and numbing. And we know that all addictions basically serve to disconnect the addict from uncomfortable feelings and uncomfortable emotions. So it's sort of counterintuitive that something that would add intensity would actually also help kind of distract the addict. But we know that's exactly what happens with these kinds of intensity behaviors. As I said, it's counterintuitive, but what we do know is that it serves to distract and ultimately numb. It just is a different chemical process. These are basically activities and drugs that put the body into a fight or flight response. They stimulate what we call a sympathetic arousal, which is basically the fight or flight thing. That's very distracting, but it's very intense and exciting at the same time. What's interesting in a lot of research, we know that a lot of people with addiction have a lot of history of trauma. And when you have a history of trauma, you would think that the last thing you would want was to create anything that would be anywhere near anxiety. You'd think that people would just be averse to that. They'd do low key, safe, low energy. But in fact, people that have had trauma often go for what we call sensation seeking. These are people that want this stimulation, that want the intensity in order to kind of escape from certain feelings. And so we do see this happening quite a bit. And there's been even more research that shows that people that have trauma tend to seek sensation in their addictive behaviors. And even more than that, people that have had really bad trauma, they go on to develop PTSD, have a very high likelihood of using methamphetamine as well. And so meth, again, was sort of the most serious of the drugs that we talk about, but people that have really the most serious cases of PTSD are the ones most likely to go toward that intensity piece. So there's a whole biochemical reason for what's going on. But so what happens when we're chasing intensity like this in the brain? For one thing, with dopamine, which is the source of the pleasures and thrills and the anticipation of more, it has what we call, I guess, a short shelf life, meaning it just requires novelty all the time. It's a very hungry for novelty. And so the things that give us intensity and excitement this week are going to kind of wear thin. By next week, they're not going to quite do it. And so we're going to have to escalate because of tolerance that we just mentioned. We're going to have to escalate and up the ante. So we see people escalating from, in the case of drugs, from smoking or snorting to injecting. We see people moving into different kinds of porn, different genres of porn that may be more taboo, kinkier, kind of even illegal, sometimes just really dark stuff, just to get the dopamine hit in very many cases. And so what happens chemically also in the brain when this is going on, we start to get scattered, and this is always a little ironic and a little humorous to me too, that meth addicts and a lot of sex and porn addicts too, when they're talking about they're in this very intense state, think that they are just totally on top of their game concentration wise. They can multitask, they're aware, they're very much sort of masters of the universe in terms of the stimulation in their world. What we know when we actually test them, they're not performing so well. They think they are, but they can't do that rapid switching between tasks. They can't follow. They get lost in detail. They get kind of mixed up. And so we know that actually it results in more disorganization in the brain over time and in the long run. So deadlines pass, priorities get missed, all that stuff that happens. So this chase for intensity is kind of a losing game because there's just never enough intensity ultimately for the addict to get the satisfaction they want. So, what do we do about this? Well, the first thing, of course, is recovery. And I think with the intensity sensation seekers, there's particular things to look at in recovery. One is to really start to be alert to triggers. We talk a lot about here about triggers and how intense these triggers are. I think when we have intensity addictions like sex or porn or chemsex, the triggers that get laid down in our brains, I call them little landmines because they're really high-powered, high-potency things that when they get triggered by accident, by chance, by fluke, they are really powerful. And early in recovery, there's no effective braking system, there's no impulse control. And so these really strong go messages that emanate from that midbrain section just really can throw the addict off because there's really no resistance once that lights up. And so you have to really be alert to your potential triggers and learn how to strategize with them. We always say the best thing for external triggers is just to avoid them. If you know that, going to a bathhouse, that's probably not a good idea if you're, a meth user, gay man, meth using guy, or avoiding situations, bars, and fair partners, cruising sites. Oh, that's a no-brainers, right? But these are the best ways that we can avoid them. Once they do happen, though, once we do get triggered, we need to be able to kind of dampen them down and help ourselves out of that. And the same thing goes, we have internal triggers too. Suddenly I'm feeling anxious, suddenly I'm feeling depressed, suddenly feeling lonely or hurt or angry. Those are all triggers as well, but those are coming from inside me. And I can't really avoid those, but I really need to learn how to manage those very effectively. So managing triggers, learning those personal grounding techniques. We've done whole webinars in this series on how to ground ourselves, breathing techniques, the 5 kind of sensation awareness grounding techniques where 5 things I can see, 4 things I can hear, that kind of thing, to really be mindful, just to really ground ourselves. I do work with sometimes clients imagining grounding cords and other kinds of physical things kind of going down the earth to hold us connected. So there's different ways of reorienting ourselves, but I think once we get into this dance for intensity and excitement, we can kind of lose our footing and become ungrounded. And I think it's really important to be able to, okay, let's touch back down to earth, get grounded and see where we're at emotionally so we can take the proper action and not relapse. So skills for maintaining the emotional equilibrium. How can I regulate my feelings? Because those are going to get topsy-turvy in a lot of ways. So corrective self-talk. I always work with my clients about that negative critical self-talk that's always like yammering in our ear, kind of undermining us, telling us how stupid we are or how we're never going to do this or what, we're going to fail again, and all that old crap. Just really learning how to turn that off and substitute more positive, kind of affirmative kind of self-talk in that. Speaking with someone, the simplest tool in the world, but how often do we forget to do it? Pick up the phone and call somebody. That's the number one really rescue tool that we can offer anybody, is to connect with another human being, and preferably somebody who is in program or your therapist or somebody who can help you and give you some perspective. So picking up your phone, reaching out, or dropping what you're doing, get into a meeting, that kind of stuff, just to really reconnect with our support system and with our recovery systems. Identifying and releasing emotions. One of the biggest struggles I think a lot of people have, especially in early recovery, is feeling feelings, and then what to do with them. I think a lot of us as addicts avoid feelings. We avoid feeling because they hurt, they're uncomfortable, but if we don't identify them and express them and release them, they're going to stay with us for a long, long time. And so I think we have to really learn in early recovery what a feeling is. What is that feeling I'm feeling? For our guys at Seeking Integrity, we have a couple different ways of identifying feelings because it's so hard for an addict in early recovery to figure out what the heck am I feeling? I just feel lousy, or I feel bad, or I feel anxious. Those are the ones that kind of mostly pop up, but then we start to fine tune that. And eventually people can start to look for names for good feelings too. Today I'm feeling grateful. Today I'm feeling happy. Today I'm feeling grounded. Those do begin to emerge, but they're not typically the first ones that emerge, because as addicts, we have a lot of backlog of the negative ones. But learning, I guess a therapist would call that affective management or affective regulation, learning how to control our emotions is going to be really critical. And then finally with this whole thing, when we're seeking intensity, when we're running from stuff, when we're trying to just so fill ourselves with intensity, whether we're bungee jumping or parachuting or going through porn or acting out sexually or putting ourselves in high risk situations where we could get arrested. I mean, all that intensity stuff. When we're in that, we're so disconnected from ourselves. The one thing we really need to do, I mentioned those grounding techniques, but I think it's really what we're missing in that formula is compassion for ourselves. And I think addicts don't have a lot of compassion. And the addicts have done a lot of bad things. They've hurt a lot of people, and it's really hard sometimes to have compassion or feel we even deserve compassion. But I think if we don't learn how to manage compassion for at least that part of us that's still that good part that I believe we all are, underneath all the stuff we've done, we have to sort of learn to get compassion for that person. And that really is a healing force. If we can start to think we're worthy of getting recovery, because there's at least some decent part of me that's worth this. And if we can't find that little glimmer of hope, that little spark, it's going to be a much tougher road. So I think just beware of the intensity. One other thing, by the way, in recovery with intensity addicts, what happens if I'm a sex addict or a porn addict or chemsex addict, in other words, an intensity addict, and I give up my addictions? Well, if I still am wired as a person to seek that intensity, I'm gonna have to find other ways. First of all, I'm gonna have to probably tone down the volume because the intensity that I've been seeking is not sustainable. All right, it's causing me damage. It's causing other people damage. It's not sustainable. But I think there is a need for not just dropping into total boredom and stillness. And so I think what we find sometimes for a lot of these guys is that it's very helpful, first of all, to avoid other intensity addictions. The one we see most common is work. Guys will get into recovery from sex and porn addiction, and suddenly they're working 80 hours a week. No, that's not okay. In our discharge planning, we'll talk about limiting our number of hours a week, and really and remember, when we're seeking this intensity, we're avoiding. And so what we don't want to do in recovery is avoid, for sure. But also to recognize that, okay, maybe there are some safer ways to do some limited intensity seeking. So maybe you like to ski, maybe you like to parachute or bungee jump, or and that's not necessarily wrong. But what I'd say is to really be careful about not overdoing it in recovery. And I'd also suggest, and I do this suggestion to my clients all the time, if you say you want to go parachuting, great, don't go by yourself, invite a group of friends, invite a group of recovery friends and do it as a group. Because the more of these recovery activities we can do together with that connection, the better it's going to be and the more healing it's going to be. So I think with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you, David. I was going to ask you about that, like the switching intensity. Is it okay, or is it better if we do it in a group? So you hit that, and I know like groups of guys, particularly chemsex addicts, often will do something like a big batch of them will go skydive. They get the intensity, but they also get the bonding, and they get some. And this is what I really wanted to ask about: is the other neurochemicals. The intensity gives us adrenaline and dopamine, but it doesn't really give us any of the other neurochemicals that create feelings of pleasure. Do intensity addicts, and sex addicts are intensity addicts, period,
Right.
especially porn addicts, do we have to replace that with other neurochemicals, and what other neurochemicals, and how do we get there?
I think somebody who is an intensity addict has gotten kind of out of balance in terms of those neurochemicals. They're heavy on the dopamine and heavy on the dopamine reward and often dopamine deficiency. They go really high, really low. It's the system's all up and down. But some of the other neurochemicals that really make us feel connected and like we belong and are more stabilizing are things like serotonin and oxytocin. That's a hormone, not a neurochemical, but these are other kinds of chemicals that come when we're in balance. We have all of those flowing in balance, and some of those, the connectivity, connecting with other people, feeling really intimate, having a great conversation with somebody. Why do we feel good after that? Well, we feel good because it's not only dopamine, it's serotonin, it's other kinds of things that are evenly balanced and flowing, and we have a much better way of kind of being connected and grounded. So yeah, I mean, intensity addicts tend to focus on just looking for the dopamine, as much dopamine as they can get, but we need other things in balance. And I think I think as opposed to worrying about, gee, which neurochemical am I trying to stimulate right now? I think just looking at the behaviors that are healthy and they involve connection, they involve, actually when we feel vulnerable, when we can sort of share with somebody, when we're feeling connected, like we belong, all those are giving us good chemicals that are very reinforcing. And by the way, soothe that need for the intensity. So that's another reason. If we can just even calling somebody, if I'm rattled and I'm, on shaky ground, just by reaching out, that hearing another person's voice sets off this other chain reaction in my head of neurochemicals that's very soothing and kind of counteracts the craziness of the dopamine going up and down because of my addiction behaviors.
Yeah. You and I, we talk about nicotine once in a while. It's a shockingly big dopamine hit. And we talk about how continuing to smoke a pack a day or 2 packs a day or whatever can actually slow down the process of the brain healing and normalizing. Is that why we don't go skydiving every day as a group or on ski trips every day? And also, does the group nature mitigate some of that dopamine hit?
Yeah, I think, intensity is fine, I guess, in balance, right? And so if we're doing something every day, and basically that's what a sex addict or a porn addict is. They're seeking that intensity usually every day, many hours a day, right? And so and that you get the tolerance that develops where we need more, so we escalate. It gets into this kind of very bad cycle. And so, yeah, when we do things less frequently, but more, on occasion, ironically, we get a much greater reward from it in that moment. We have a better impact because we're not doing it all the time. So that's one thing. But by doing it in a group setting, we're getting all those other benefits of connection with each other, of sharing, and it's also very grounding when we're doing that. Plus, I think what happens if you're a solo person. I had a client, for example, who was he was a skier, and he would go. And I'm not a skier, but the double X things that off the back of the mountain that are like unpatrolled, those kind of things. He would get high and then go on those. Not smart, but boy, was it a trip. It was pretty intense. But so when you're doing that, you're just up in your head like you are. You could be looking at porn because it was just, although he was actively moving down a mountain, hopefully moving and not hitting a tree or something, but he was keeping moving. But when we're in a group doing some skiing, it's not a fantasy trip. We're connected with other people. We're out in the real world, as opposed to up in our heads with this experience. So I think that there's something very calming and grounding about being in a group doing these kind of activities. And by the way, I would still, great, bungee jump, skydive, but balance that out. Balance that out with quiet time, with reading, with meditating. I think the human mind needs that balance. And we can't always be just getting stimulation all the time. That's sensations. We need to learn how to be quiet. And by the way, I didn't mention this, but it's well known to any sex addict, but sex addicts and porn addicts and chemsex addicts have a terrible time sitting still. Boredom is a huge relapse risk because they get antsy and you start to feel feelings and things come up. And so the idea of increasing your ability to tolerate low stimulation settings like boredom or relaxation or reading a book or meditating or just being mindful or doing nothing. That can be a real challenge, but I would suggest that every intensity addict learn how to do that to counteract the need for sensation.
Thank you. Type your questions into the Q&A. We've got several in there already. We're going to get to them in a minute, but I have one more question for David. So you mentioned trauma at the beginning, and you said you would think people who've been traumatized would not go seeking intensity. But most of our addictions, if we're here, are all about intensity. And sometimes we say sex addiction is not about sex. And I would maybe throw out that intensity addictions in general are not about intensity. They're about escape. Addicts
Right.
don't use to feel good. We use to feel less or to feel nothing is what we're
Right.
really aiming for most of the time.
Right.
But at the same time, there is also, particularly with sexual trauma, there can be trauma repetition where we're trying to master it and control it. And we throw ourselves into the fight, flight, freeze all over again by attempting to. Is there a link here? Is one more important than the other? Or do these all just sort of turn into this big hot mess of a soup. I mean, how does all this go together with
The risk
with
of a big
trauma
hot
as
mess
push
is pretty high.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're actually two slightly different things, but they do kind of intertwine, right? So generally, there's a need for sensation seeking or intensity seeking as a way of distracting, as a way of kind of pulling us out of into feeling something. And I think it has some parallels, frankly, with people who cut or burn. It's a way of feeling something, but not the pain. And it's an interesting kind of phenomena, but where I think we're sort of expressing that. Trauma repetition is a slightly different thing, but a very real thing and very common. And that's if we have a traumatic experience, usually as children, sexually assaulted or something. Very often, much to the mystery of the individual, they will try to sort of fall into that, recreating similar kind of sexual scenes or dynamics as adults. And the theory is that people are doing that, just as you said, Scott, to kind of repeat it, but this time in a safe way. And this time I'm in control. And then so this is sexual play, it's kinks, it's other things. The problem I have as a trauma therapist with that is that very often they're just, the idea from the individual's point of view is that, okay, I'm going to do this, I'll be in control of it, and I'll have some resolution. I won't feel the traumatic effects anymore as a way of healing. The problem is people very rarely get the healing. They almost always just repeat sort of some of the
work. It didn't work.
No, that it just kind of gets the trauma reactivated. And so it's not a great strategy, but it's one that's kind of intuitive to people until they get into some real trauma therapy, I think.
So before we jump into the questions, I wanted to read this that popped up in the chat feature, and this was actually put in the chat feature before you started talking, David. So I just want you to know you nailed it on the topic.
Okay.
So it says, I'm still in the very beginning of getting on the wagon, so to speak. I pretty much stopped the sexual acting out, which includes looking on apps. And I found that I'm so much more relaxed when the secret hookup life isn't something that I'm thinking about nearly every minute of every waking hour. I've been so keyed up for so long, I hadn't even realized how keyed up I was until this was gone. And now I can actually relapse. Being in these groups is really helping me understand what's going on in my head. Thank you guys for providing the space, super helpful. You're welcome. David, is this a usual thing where we don't even realize we're just wired beyond belief?
Totally. And remember when we're doing this intensity run in an addictive way with sex, porn, chemsex, gambling, however we're doing it, we're actually running kind of in fight or flight nonstop. And so our adrenals get shot, we have all this cortisol, we have all these stress hormones, we have this adrenaline flowing through, and it's just our bodies are kind of out of whack, and to the point where we don't even realize it. And so I think, yeah, once people stop and slow down, that was a beautifully written a couple sentences there, because it really captured it just gorgeously. And then once we settle down, we realize, my God, first of all, how exhausted we are, but also kind of how much running we were doing really to no effect. And I think so, yeah, I think that's very much the case. And so very typically you'll get people that are just exhausted emotionally for a while after these behaviors and these runs, for sure.
Yeah, that reminds me, you were talking about how, meth users in particular, but I think any intensity addict, we spin and we spin and we spin and we think we're under control and we're being really productive, and in point of fact, we're just spinning on the hamster wheel. I've talked to guys who do meth who are like, they clean when that's, they get compulsive cleaning, but they'll take a toothbrush and clean the bathroom sink for 6 hours. I mean, they're not actually getting anything done except they're just throwing a toothbrush and rubbing holes in the enamel on their sink.
Right. Because what happens when we're in this kind of frenzy of activity is that our executive function kind of goes offline. So we have no kind of adult in the room saying, whoa, this is not the best use. If we're going to scrub with the toothbrush, let's do a little here, a little there. But that don't have that insight when we're caught up in that, especially with meth, where people suddenly taking apart their toaster seems like a great idea. by dawn, there's toasters in 8,000 parts on their breakfast table, so it's not a very productive use of that energy.
And we use the taking apart the toaster as sort of a joking example, but we also use it because they do this. I mean, I know several people who have taken apart a toaster for no apparent reason other than,
Right. There's something about the mystery of small appliances that that's very appealing to a meth addict. So
When I was a little kid, I used to pull apart my Hot Wheels, but yeah, no.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's jump into the questions. Sorry. As a betrayed partner, I find it frustrating that I'm expected to tolerate slips and even relapses. I really want to have a zero tolerance for slip and relapse. How am I supposed to protect myself from additional betrayal and trauma and leave the room while I leave room for the recovery process of an addict? That's a very good question.
Yeah, and I totally identify with what you're saying here, and it makes perfect sense because from a betrayed partner's point of view, slips and relapses are the very behaviors that were so traumatizing and led to all this other emotional pain. So I totally understand that. I think it's really trying to find a balance between just the reality of recovery from one of these addictions and versus trying to make it safe, emotionally safe for the partner. And the reality is that very few people, I was going to say nobody, but I guess I can never say nobody, but very few people can do this like, okay, I'm going to get clean and sober from the first time out and do it, without having slips, without having even relapses. When I was working with methamphetamine clients I'm recovered from alcohol. I'm an old abstinence guy. And then with meth, I really had to start learning relapse is part of it. It happens. And so I kind of learned to tolerate it on the way toward abstinence, right? In that case. So I think I understand the discomfort here. I just think it's just I think it would be more uncomfortable to say, okay, we're going to go for a perfect score. And when it doesn't happen, to have that disappointment over and over again, right? On the part of the partner. And so I think just trying to be realistic about it. And what we try to do, by the way, is okay, we talk about what are we going to do if a slip or relapse occurs? Well, what do we do? And we do it soon, right? We reach out to another program person, we call our sponsor, we call our therapist, we get clean, and we tell our spouse. But the spouse is not necessarily the first call, and that's really just to save the butt of the addict, because the therapist and the recovery friends are often a source of support. But we do want the partner to be aware of that, not to cause them pain, but to just keep them informed. And I don't know if every partner feels like this, but I've had an awful lot of wives tell me, it wasn't so much the behavior, it was the lying about it, it was the dishonest about it, it was the delay letting me know. And of course, it's part of the behavior too. But I think just really where we really want to be clear and clean is in the lying part of it, right? I think if people are going to slip, and I suspect they will, and eventually, by the way, that I think we can start to expect, a no slip, a perfect abstinence kind of policy after a while. But in the beginning, it's just not realistic, and so we try to accommodate that in ways that we can by cutting down the lying, by informing everybody as soon as possible. But it's not ideal, but it's the best we can do given the reality of early recovery.
David, do you think intensity addictions and intensity addicts are more vulnerable to early recovery slips and relapses than less intense addictions?
I actually do. There's no literature on this, by the way. I'd love to see research on this, but because of the high levels of dopamine, just ridiculously high, than any other thing, sex, porn, meth, and cocaine are the four like super stimulants that just they don't compare to anything else, the amount of dopamine they cause. And so I think when somebody is riding at those stellar heights and then crashing and going up and down again, their ability to regulate is really damaged. In fact, with meth, and to a certain extent with pornography and sex addiction, what we call the dopamine reward circuitry, the transporters, without getting too technical, the way the brain distributes dopamine, that whole system gets damaged, with meth particularly. And so people don't have especially meth users, don't have the literally the brain chemicals to kind of regulate the moods adequately. So they're at the mercy of all these neurochemicals going up and down. And that meth is by far the worst, but we do see that to some extent with sex and porn addiction too. So yeah, they're fighting their brain chemistry. Does that get better? Yes, but it takes a while. Remember the dopamine system has been damaged, and that takes, we've done research on meth users. It takes up to 24 months. Now, meth is particularly toxic. The sex and porn addicts don't have nearly that much damage, but it can take a matter of months. And so I think in the first probably 90 days, we got to really run a very tight program. For sure.
The older you are, the longer it can take.
Unfortunately, yeah. That's a sad truth, that the younger guys rebound much more quickly.
So as far as a betrayed partner protecting yourself in the events of slips and relapses, I think maybe one of the things you can do is insist on rigorous honesty. If you slip or relapse, I need to know, and then you can look for progress rather than perfection. But it's always going to hurt, if there's a slip or a relapse, particularly with sex or porn addiction, because it is an intimate betrayal all over again.
Right.
And it's devastating. And it's like, here you are in recovery and you're doing it again. And you know how much it hurts me, and you still, and it's that fine line of giving leeway while protecting yourself.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult. So thank you for bringing that up. We kind of just talked about this, but I'll let you do it some more, David. Hello, Dr. Fawcett. If addicts need intensity to function, can creating a fake sense of urgency help with anhedonia or motivation? I don't think we need intensity to function, but with anhedonia and a lack of motivation, you may want to explain what those are, but can creating a false sense of urgency help with that?
Yeah, so anhedonia is something that happens in early recovery for a lot of intensity addictions. And it literally means the inability to experience pleasure. And what that stems from is when these high intensity addicts are acting out, this resets the pleasure system, if you will. And so the minimum level of stimulation I need to even feel pleasure gets hijacked to this really high point. So after a while, the only way I can feel pleasure if I'm a meth addict is to be high on meth, or if I'm a sex addict, to be acting out sexually. And everything else is so far below that, it doesn't even register. And so all normal life stuff, when we give up those high intensity things for a period of time, our brain has to kind of readjust back to being able to find pleasure in normal everyday stuff, in a hug from our spouse, or good food, or great music, or doing something we love, or all the stuff that gives us dopamine in normal life. That all that normal life stuff feels kind of blah and uninteresting. And by the way, we start to feel hopeless in that period. So this is a bad setup for the addict, because I'm working hard to stay sober. I'm not feeling better. In fact, I'm feeling kind of worse. I'm not feeling excited about anything. Food doesn't taste good. My partner doesn't look so good. My dog doesn't love me as much as he used to, or whatever. And plus, we're just kind of not getting the stimulation, the pleasure we're getting. So what to do with that? Part of it is to kind of ride it out. I always try to tell clients I work with to kind of expect that this is not forever, because it can be very discouraging for somebody if they're working really hard and just, my God, they're feeling hopeless, they're feeling lousy, and we tend to project, this is how I'm going to feel the rest of my life. And that's not the truth, right? The truth is that people will normalize and feel better. But when you're in that state, it doesn't necessarily do good to increase the intensity, because it's, in a way, it's kind of going back to the way you were before, but also and I think it also is slowing down the brain's readjustment back to being able to find pleasure in normal everyday things. And so I'd be cautious about that. I think it's best just to feel a little bit of the anhedonia, understand that it's not forever, put in safeguards to control the impulsivity and the hopelessness and all the kind of mood things that can go on. And certainly I think, we want to seek sensation and stimulation and pleasure, but I think we want to do it in all healthy ways. I'd be very cautious. I wouldn't recommend, for example, somebody in early recovery from sex or porn addiction to start going out and doing parachuting to try to substitute. It's just, don't do that. Just allow yourself to feel the feelings for the first, couple of months, and then start to see where you land and how it evens out.
Yeah, when I said earlier, I know groups of guys who are in recovery from meth and things like that who go like parachuting as a group. They all have several years
Oh yeah,
sobriety when they do that.
Right.
And it's a bonding exercise, and they, so yeah. Yeah, creating a fake sense of urgency to pump up the volume, it's just going to slow your process down.
Right.
It's going to slow the healing process down. It's going to drag it out longer. And I find that when guys know, oh, this will end, it will just abate over time, and I'll wake up one day and chocolate cake will taste good again. And won't that be nice?
Exactly.
Just that knowledge makes it easier to tolerate.
Exactly. I think that's why, even by the way, I find with meth addicts, I think one of the reasons people really like my book is because I go into some of the reasons or what meth does in the brain and how that looks in recovery. And in recovery, the brain has to do some healing, and it explains some of the behaviors that we see very common in early meth recovery. And so it almost reduces the stigma and the shame of it. If a guy can tell himself, okay, I'm doing this not because I'm a bad person or I'm a lousy recovering person, but my brain is healing, it just helps them feel better about it and not so much shame. So I think that's a really important piece.
This next one is talking about addicts sort of impulsively saying and doing things in their relationship that are not pleasant for the other person. So the question is, do addicts suffer from a lack of emotional intelligence? Do they do these things to get a reaction? Do they not realize the effect of what they're saying, and what causes this? Does substance addiction cause this? Does other addictions cause this? What leads to this sort of nasty behavior that we often see from addicts?
Right. I think those behaviors can have different sources, which makes it a little confusing. I think sometimes when we see, often in this webinar, we'll have usually spouses writing in and saying their the addict partner is, irritable and blaming and kind of nasty and not pleasant. And so all that in that context, I think, can be a symptom of somebody really not working their program, not really engaged in the recovery process, because that's a really classic sign of an addict kind of getting off the path if they start to blame and they're irritable and all that stuff. That's kind of
it's really early recovery, particularly with sex addicts. That can be a sign of withdrawal too. That
totally.
can be a sign that they're actually sober.
Yeah, it's true. That's right. But 3 or 4 months in or 6 months in, if that nastiness continues, that's a problem. Now, sometimes we also see that just people don't really have relationship skills very much. We talk about addicts having sort of these attachment disorders or intimacy disorders. I think a lot of times people don't really know how to talk, how to communicate. I think sometimes there's been some damage in the relationship, and there's been some patterns that have been established with really kind of angry words, bickering, that kind of stuff. And I think couples therapy can really be helpful in those situations. So I think there's different causes for it. Do substances cause this? Yeah, and so do behavioral addictions, in that it kind of causes people to be less careful with each other. They're more careless with each other's feelings. People get very self-centered. The addict gets very self-centered. I guess my expectation in recovery is that this should start to improve. And as Scott said, the irritable signs can be a sign of withdrawal early on. But I'd say after 90 days, things should start to really improve. Withdrawal doesn't extend beyond probably 2 weeks, if that, probably 72 hours or a week. But to give somebody the benefit of the doubt, 90 days to sort of learn those skills, learn how to control their emotions, learn how not to react, learn how not to be impulsive, learn how to communicate effectively, perhaps, all that should start to improve. And so I think it depends on where you're at in the recovery cycle. Early on, it's maybe to be expected. After that, though, with time, I think you have a right to have healthy communication, to have courtesy in the relationship, to have consideration for each other's feelings, to have some empathy starting to emerge. All those things, those little green shoots of kind of a healthy relationships to start to be coming out. And I think it's really important for people to try. And by the way, and I think this is for the addict and perhaps the partner too, is that those things may not come naturally at first. We may not be this sparkling, kind, generous, empathetic person that just emerges just because I stop my addictive behavior. And so this is where step work starts to come in, and looking at my character defects and sort of making those amends. And all this takes time, right? Those don't happen in the first couple months. And so it's definitely a process. But I think there should be a trend toward improvement. And if those remarks still tend to be kind of bounced around, tossed around, hurtful things, and I mean, every couple has those moments, right? But in general, there should be a significant improvement, I think, with time in recovery.
Yeah, David, I'm so glad you brought up step work, because whenever I think about learning how to interact with other people, I got more from step work than I got from therapy or any of that stuff. The 12 steps are really designed to help me be a human being among human beings. I mean, steps 1, 2, and 3 are, I have a problem, I need help, I think I'll accept help. Then at 4, we start looking at ourselves. 4 is I take a searching and fearless moral inventory of myself. 5 is I share it. 6 and 7 are I identify and I start working on my character defects. And 8 and 9 is I figure out who I need to make amends to for my bad behavior. And then I make amends. And then step 10, which is the next step, is kind of steps 4 through 9 all rolled into one. It's a quick inventory that may or may not end with an amends. And, so 4 through 9, I get right with the world. Step 10 helps me stay right with the world. And what an amazing thing. And then 11 and 12 deal with spirituality and helping other people.
Right.
But the 12 steps were, step 4 for me was a revelation. I was convinced that everyone else was the problem. When I did step 4, I realized, oh, I'm the jerk who's screwing up my life. Maybe I need to do something about it. And somewhere along the way, I realized I was making life difficult, not only for me, but for the people around me. And that was another revelation. But these are not step 1 or 2 or 3. They're steps 4 through 9 and then 10. I mean, it's a process to get there.
And remember, I was having this conversation with a friend of mine earlier today who's in recovery as well, but we tend to freeze wherever we start to get actively addicted, right? Emotionally. And so, I started probably actively drinking and drugging as a teenager. And when I got into recovery, and I was only in my 20s, I was relatively young, but and the friend I was talking to today had similar age of recovery. And we recalled that it seemed like we were 13 again when we got into recovery, like a lot of memories, a lot of feelings. It's like I had frozen emotionally at that point. And so I was a grown man coming into recovery, but I had the kind of the emotional life of a adolescent. And so I think, and that's not unusual, I think, for a lot of addicts. So I think we have to sort of grow and mature. And I always tell the story when I was doing my book about gay men, the subtitle, the original subtitle that didn't get used was something like reclaiming healthy sex and intimacy or something. I realized addicts aren't reclaiming anything. We never had it. And so this is really about learning healthy sex and intimacy from the beginning, not reclaiming it. So I think addicts have a steep learning curve about how to relate, how to live their lives in a normal way without escaping or without medicating or without numbing. It's a huge challenge. And it's not just about the drugs or the behaviors. It's about how we live our whole lives. And this is where the step, to tie it back to step work, this is where the step work ties the addictive behavior into the rest of our lives. Because step 1 is all about really giving up the behaviors, right? Everything after that is really reflecting on growth, personal growth. And that's what addicts need to do. And that is not an overnight job, not at all.
And I would agree about, I discovered alcohol and drugs and sex in middle school, and that is when my emotional growth stopped. So from then until I got sober, I was treating people the way a middle school boy treats people. And suddenly I was in my late 30s getting sober and still treating people like a 13-year-old boy treats people, right. And realizing this is not what adults do. And, I had some growing, and it took a while. So, yeah. You mentioned earlier that addicts suffer from poor executive function. How long does recovery take, and what can be done to speed that up?
Good question. So what is executive function? Our brain has several different parts, but the prefrontal cortex up here is the kind of the higher brain. That's where we have a lot of our skills that give us language and abstract thinking and all these spirituality and all these kind of cool concepts. Unfortunately, in the course of addiction, which comes from a different part of the brain, the midbrain, that part of that midbrain sort of takes over when the addict is active. And there've actually been a lot of studies that show how the neural connections between those two parts of the brain get really kind of frayed. And so in many ways, the prefrontal cortex is just kind of turned off. The midbrain, or the addictive part of the brain, takes over. And so to put it in very kind of graphic addiction terms, it's the midbrain has all those go messages. It's where those landmines I was talking about earlier of get laid down of like these really sharp memories of intense pleasure and by the way, addicts, like human beings, tend to forget all the bad stuff. We remember all the hot good times, but not all the trauma and remorse that happened afterwards. But we remember that stuff. So all these go, and normally in a normal human being, the prefrontal cortex would be there to say, whoa, let's slow this down. Let's put on some brakes. Let's think about this. That wouldn't go so well. And none of that's happening when we're in our addiction, because that part of our brain is turned off. Now, the good news is that once we get into recovery, those neural pathways start to reconnect and strengthen up, but it's not overnight either. So it takes probably, I would say, at least 90 days before that starts to really get good connection back. And so in the meantime, this is where, we talk at Seek Integrity about we create a container, right? A safe container where people can explore and sort of come back to life. But we're going to kind of hold the safety for them. In early recovery, I think one of the reasons we always talk about connection and getting into a recovery program is because I, as an addict in early recovery, I don't have much control to stop those impulses. What I do have control over is how I surround myself with people who can help me do that until I can do it for myself. So if I'm saying, hey, I'm, David, I'm an addict and alcoholic, and I'm really feeling bad, I'm really nervous, and I'm thinking about drinks, and I might not have much control to talk myself off the ledge myself, but if I'm putting that out in a meeting, I'm going to get a lot of support from other people. And eventually I do get more ability to kind of self-regulate. Not totally. I always need those people and that outside influence. But so that part of the brain does come back, but it takes a while. And there's ways we know from different amino acids that help that neural regeneration. And ironically, one of the things that produces those amino acids is exercise. And so exercise is a really good thing. Exercise helps us really speed up the healing of those neural pathways because it generates all the proteins that are needed to rebuild them. Now, I'm talking about intensity tonight, and I have had intensity addicts who got into exercise, and suddenly they were damaging their knees or their hips or their ankles because they were working too hard. So again, we got to employ that goal of moderation and stuff like exercise too. But exercise is a good thing to help the brain kind of reestablish itself.
When there is sexual abuse of a male child by his mother, is it possible he would want to be hurt that way as a fetish, or is that normalizing the abuse? We kind of covered this earlier, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about arousal templates, which is that kind of map of what we find appealing in our heads, which is always evolving and growing as we live our lives well into old age. In fact, we keep getting new sexual ideas that get imported there. The very first place, and John Money from Hopkins, who really sort of did the original research in this, talked about the effects of abuse. And one of the examples he gave was a mother sexually abusing her child. And he talked about that as really hijacking the whole, what he called the love map at that point. Now we call it an arousal template. But basically how that does totally warp that child's arousal template, so that dynamic, even though it was abuse, will be replicated and will be an element of potential attraction down the road. We see this in other ways with even violence, where people have to have certain amounts of violence recreated to get sexually aroused because that was part of the abuse they had. So yeah, this will, well, it can play out. I won't say it always does, but it chances are it will play out in the future. And so that's a case, I think, where good trauma therapy can really sort of intervene and help that person at least mitigate or neutralize that particular aspect of their arousal template. But yeah, those things that happen to us early in life, even before we're really sexual, we don't know we're sexual, but it affects our sexual lives down the road after we grow up, because these are really traumatic events.
And this isn't just male child abused by mother. This is any child abused by
any child abuse by anybody.
Overt incest, covert incest, any kind of other sexualized child abuse, maybe not necessarily incest. I mean, all of these effects show up fairly consistently with
Totally.
later life. So, I love this last question we've got here. Does porn addiction unchecked always escalate to massage parlors, escorts, chemsex, and so on? I can recall rationalizing every next step of the way, moving from one to the other over the years. Are they related? So we started with porn and we ended up with chemsex. Does that always happen, or a lot, or what's the deal?
I think what we can say always happens is there's always escalation. And that's due to simply the tolerance, meaning, you know, what does it for me today is not going to do it next week. And so I always need to have more. I have seen cases where people got into really, you know, dark, kinky genres of porn or whatever, and that still wasn't enough. And so sometimes that translates into other kinds of behaviors. So it may real world behaviors, massage parlors or strip clubs or affairs or that kind of thing. And I've also seen people add chemicals. So people might add, you know, cocaine or marijuana or even methamphetamine as a way of just upping the ante. If they're already a drug user, they may go from smoking and snorting to injecting. You know, anything to get more of that intensity. And it's a losing battle, because it's diminishing returns every time we're doing something. And so we always have to seek new intensity. So there's this propensity to escalate. The way it looks kind of depends on circumstances. Frankly, I think I always say addiction is very opportunistic. I think it depends on opportunity. If I'm a porn addict and I'm starting to escalate, it's not quite doing for me anymore, and maybe I'm on a business trip and maybe all my friends are going to a strip club. I never thought of that, but I'll go, and suddenly that's a new thing. And so I think these opportunities and chance sometimes will introduce new things, and we'll pick it up. So, you know, the thing we can say with certainty that always happens is the escalation.
Yeah, you know, I teach sex addiction 6-week work groups online, and a lot of guys usually the beginning point is porn, and then it spins out of control to affairs or strip clubs or whatever. But I also teach straight up porn addiction work groups online, and these are guys whose behavior is porn and no porn. I mean, if you go to an AA meeting, half the people there are straight up alcoholics, and half of them are like me. They're just a garbage can, you know, anything that'll get me high. Great. I don't care if it's liquid, powder, you know, whatever. It always escalates. And the guys who are straight up porn addicts, you know, they drink or they look at more porn, or they look at more intense versions of porn. They discover new and more intense, more outre stuff. They start looking at things that violate their values and sometimes violate laws. So it can escalate that way, or it can escalate to other behaviors. You know, alcoholics, you know, they start out with a couple of beers, and then they switch to wine, and then they switch to hard liquor, and, you know, they just drink more and more and more, you know, if they're just a straight up alcoholic. But, you know, like a heroin addict, nobody's first drug is heroin, ever. Nobody starts out shooting heroin. Nobody,
or meth for that matter.
Right, or meth. Nobody wants to end up in some skeezy falling down house with a needle in their arm that 3 other people just used. Nobody wants to get there. It starts out with the beer or a joint. You know, we smoke a little pot, we have a beer, and, you know, it escalates a little bit, and eventually we're stealing grandma's pain pills, and we're popping those when we smoke a joint or whatever. And then we're crushing them and putting them in the joint and smoking it to get a faster hit, and then we're snorting it, and then we're cooking it, and injecting it, and suddenly we're in, the skeezy house with the needle in our arm, and we wonder how the hell we got there.
Yeah. So
Because
true.
it just is like poof. And, and if in this question, I remember justifying every step of the way, any addict can justify every step of the way. That's denial. That's, it's part of addiction. One of the symptoms of addiction is it tells you you don't have a problem.
Right.
If somebody else was doing this behavior, they'd be crazy, but it's okay for me because, and then fill in the blank with any crazy ass thing you can think of. That's how addiction works. It's okay for me because, yeah.
So true. Totally true. Yeah.
So, but every addiction will escalate. Every addiction will create bigger and bigger problems until you get into recovery. We are out of time. Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you for the great questions and the great topic, David. Anything you want to say to take us out today?
No, just I really appreciated the questions as well. I think really informed and good stuff. Appreciate it. And great discussion. Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, thank you. We'll be back same time, same place next week. We hope to see you then.
All righty. Good night.